So welcome everyone to the latest edition of World Affairs Friday, sponsored by the Peoria Area World Affairs Council. We are a nonpartisan, community-based organization dedicated to learning about our world from right here in Central Illinois. The Peoria Area World Affairs Council prides itself on having a large tent that covers many viewpoints, and we have a great deal of pride in offering civil discussion even when we disagree. So the likelihood that we will continue the rest of this year online is pretty high. And so I hope that you guys are all enjoying these Zoom programs and can tune in for thoughtful and informative discussions for the rest of the year on this format. Allow me to introduce our guest today. Peter Barnard is an American columnist, journalist, and liberal political commentator. And those are his words from his biography. He is a senior columnist at Haaretz and contributor to The Atlantic and National Journal, and a political contributor to programs on CNN. He recently took over as editor-in-chief at Jewish Currents. A former editor of The New Republic, he has written for Time, The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, among other periodicals, and is the author of 3 books. He's associate professor of journalism and political science at City University of New York. So good morning. Good morning to those of us here in Central Illinois. Good afternoon to Peter. And today we've invited you to discuss your essay that appeared earlier this month in Jewish Currents. And help me, is it pronounced Yavni?
Yeah, Yavna.
Yavna, okay, Yavna, a Jewish case for equality in Israel-Palestine. It caused quite a stir, perhaps with the strongest response coming from fellow American Jews. So would you take a moment just to give us a basic primer, a basic overview of the makeup of the American Jewish community? Clearly it's not a monolith, and it might be helpful to get a picture of the spectrum of views within the American Jewish community itself.
Sure. So I think if you wanted to understand, there are lots of ways of slicing the American Jewish community. Even the term American Jewish as opposed to Jewish American is one that already I think suggests a divide in the sense that I think probably I use the term American Jew, which is to say that American is the adjective that defines the noun Jew, suggesting that being Jewish is the more central identity. But I think probably for a majority of American Jews, the term Jewish American would be more appropriate, which is to say that American is their stronger form of identity rather than being Jewish. On the question of Israel-Palestine, which I wrote about, I would say the American Jewish community is divided both religiously and generationally. So that if you look at a spectrum of Jews religiously, starting with Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, and then those who have no religious affiliation, as you move down that spectrum from, let's say, most observant to less observant, you tend to find that people are more left-leaning as they become less, again, in general, this is of course not true for everybody, but in general, people who are less religiously observant tend to be further to the left, both on American politics and Israel-Palestine. I think that's true for American Christians as well. For instance, if you looked at compared American Christians who go to church weekly versus those who don't go to church weekly, you probably find that among white American Christians, that white American Christians who go to church every week probably lean more Republican than white American Christians who are more secular. So you have something of that same divide among American Jews. You also have a clear divide generationally. I mean, you have a generational divide in general in American politics today, with younger people being more to the left, but it certainly also exists among American Jews, which is that you find younger American Jews tend to be more critical of Israeli policy, and even more willing to kind of question basic notions of the idea of a Jewish state, in part because their generational experience has been very different. They haven't grown up. They of course have no memory of the Holocaust. They don't even have a memory of 1967, which was a transformative moment in American Jewish politics when it appeared to many Jews that Israel's existence was threatened. And they would be more likely to have grown up and seen Israel as a kind of regional superpower, and to be more aware perhaps of the way in which Israel's policies deny Palestinians basic rights. So I would say you can see it as a kind of a, if you map American Jewish politics, you could map it on two axes. The first would be the axis of religiosity. The second would be the axis of generation. And with the most left-leaning quadrant being the younger, more secular American Jews, and the most conservative being older and more religious American Jews.
That's an interesting perspective. And I'm glad you pointed out
religiously
why.
observant. Religiously observant.
Right,
I don't want to say
right.
religious is more complicated, but let's say religiously
Right.
observant.
Observant is good. And that leads me to my next question, because I was curious about, the American Jews is the way that you use the term in your essay. Do Jewish people who live in America differ broadly from Jewish people who live in any European state, for example?
Yes, I would say if you look at diaspora communities, basically you could say, let's imagine that roughly a third of the Jews in the world are in the United States, a third are in Israel, and a third are in other places. That's a very kind of crude generalization. If you were to compare American Jews versus the Jews in other diaspora communities, Australia, Canada, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, France, Britain, you find that South Africa, where my own parents are from, what you would find is that American Jews are the most assimilated of those diaspora communities, and they are the least, in some ways, they are the least of a community. Which is to say, there is less of an American Jewish community than there is an Australian, Canadian, British Jewish community, partly because our numbers are larger, but also because since the community is less traditional, it's more diffuse. A smaller percentage of American Jews belong to synagogues than in those other communities. A smaller percentage send their children to Jewish day schools. A higher percentage get intermarried. So that means that the American Jewish community doesn't have a cultural center in the way that these other communities do as much. It also means that the American Jewish community has, I would say, a kind of wider ideological spectrum. It has very, very conservative elements, but it has a larger kind of left progressive political element, especially on Israel-Palestine, because there is a larger, more secular, less traditional population. Again, each community has its own dynamics. American Jews have been in the United States for a relatively long time, which has hastened the process of assimilation. America is also a particularly assimilationist society, more so than even a country like Canada or Britain. People tend to lose their ethnic and religious identities faster in the United States than they do in those other societies for various reasons. Again, and I think also, if you compare the United States, the American Jewish community, to France, America, for instance, the American Jewish community is also overwhelmingly Ashkenazi, which means overwhelmingly composed of Jews who come from Central and Eastern Europe, whereas the French Jewish community, for instance, is mostly composed of Jews from North Africa. And as again, very, very making very, very broad generalizations, I would say that the political currents among Ashkenazi Jews are more progressive than they are among what are called Sephardi or Mizrahi Jews, Jews who trace their origin to North Africa and the Middle East.
That leads me to my next question. You also use the term in your essay about liberal Zionism. Would you give us a good ballpark definition of what a liberal Zionist is?
Sure. So let me start with Zionism. Zionism is a movement that emerges in the late 19th century in Europe. The Jews have religiously been, religious Jews, observant Jews, prayed for a return to Zion, which is really a term that just means Jerusalem or Israel, right? Since the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, which Jews marked yesterday in a holiday called Tisha B'Av. And so since that exile, that dispersion 2,000 years ago, the Jews have religiously been longing for a return, but the traditional notion in Jewish law was that such a return could only take place from the hand of God through through a Messiah who would bring in a messianic era that would return Jews to the land of Israel and rebuild the temples and change life in all kinds of other profound ways. Starting in the late 19th century, a group of mostly fairly secular Jews start to challenge that for a variety of reasons that one could go into. Partly it's the realization that anti-Semitism, which many Jewish liberals thought was going to recede as a result of the Enlightenment and modernity, when it becomes clear in the late 19th and early 20th century that anti-Semitism is going to adapt to the modern era and remain a very powerful force, liberals like Theodor Herzl and Leon Pinsker, two famous Zionists who originally just wanted to be citizens of Europe, begin to think that that's not possible. Secondly, the great European empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire start to break up, and you have the rise of nationalism all over Central and Eastern Europe. And so as the Ukrainians and the Poles and the Serbs and Hungarians and Romanians are all saying, we are now going to create our nation, Jews look around and say, well, where do we build our nation? And so political Zionism, which is the idea that Jews can politically take actions to bring about a large-scale movement of Jews back to what we call Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, and build either a state or at least a society there, emerges as a result of the endurance of anti-Semitism and the rise of nationalism in the late 19th century. Sorry if these answers are a little bit long, but these are short questions, but they have so much in them. So the question of what liberal Zionism means is that liberal Zionism is a notion in which this Jewish return, this creation of a Jewish state, or at least a Jewish society in the land of Israel, also needs to try to be in accordance with liberal principles, which is to say principles of liberal democracy, equality under the law, basic individual rights. Herzl was very much a European liberal. He was very blind, as many Zionists were, to the realities of Palestinian Arab existence in the land of Israel. But his vision of what kind of society he wanted to build was very much built on his idealized notion of what a kind of liberal Austrian or German society might have looked like. And so liberal Zionism is an attempt to deal with the, I think, inherent tension between a movement that is focused on the liberation of a particular ethno-religious group, Jews, and the reality that this state, or even this society, is actually not only Jewish, of course, but includes the population that existed when Jews in large numbers begin arriving in Israel-Palestine, which is the Palestinian Arab population. And so this tension between liberalism and Zionism, I think, is one that liberal Zionists have tried to negotiate and manage and mitigate, whereas some other Zionists haven't been as concerned about it.
Very good. And don't worry about answering long answers. We are an organization that thrives on information and knowledge. So, and I invite all of our participants to submit questions via the chat. And so we will have plenty of time after I ask a few more. So if you've got questions, by all means, put them in the chat box and we'll get to them in a couple minutes. But since you brought up nationalism, it made me think of the term illiberal democracy. Is there such a thing as illiberal Zionism?
Certainly there is. I mean, there are those who would argue that Zionism is inherently illiberal, and I think that depends a little bit. I'm not one of those people, but then again, I have an idiosyncratic and kind of minority view of what Zionism is. But there is the Zionist movement was, on the one hand, very much conceived of Jews as a return to this land that, although most Jews had not lived there in their lifetimes, that they had been praying for fervently and believed was their natural and ultimate home. On the other hand, it had many features of a settler colonial movement, which is to say, it was a movement of Europeans to a part of what we would now call the developing or post-colonial or third world, in which those Europeans were supported by the European powers, most famously in 1917 when the British issued the Balfour Declaration and said that Israel-Palestine would be a Jewish national home. Right, even though Jews at that point represented a very small percentage of the population of people who were there, the vast majority of whom were Palestinian, Palestinian Arabs. And secondly, this Zionist movement had a very kind of classical colonial language about progress and civilization, much of which was informed by a kind of racial notion of Europeans as being kind of superior to people in the Arab world. And in addition to that, the Zionist movement led to the dispossession of very, very large numbers of Palestinians. Most in the most concentrated form that took place during Israel's War of Independence from 1947 to 1949, when somewhere in the order of 750,000 Palestinians were essentially forced from their homes. This settler colonial element of Zionism is, I think most people would agree, is deeply illiberal and shares deeply illiberal qualities with other settler colonial movements that have essentially dispossessed native populations from the land, whether those are in Australia or Canada or the United States or other places.
Yeah, it's a good analogy to make, because we displaced a whole lot of Native Americans when we Europeans moved into North America. So following on with that, you use that term Yavna in your title for your essay. Would you like to give us just a little bit of a background on using that term as well, the history of that?
Sure. So famously in Jewish history and Jewish texts, when the Second Temple was about to be destroyed, again, 70 CE, by the Romans. The First Temple had been destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians, but relatively quickly had been reconstituted. But when the Second Temple was about to be destroyed, again, the holiday, the Jewish holiday which memorializes this, which is called Tisha B'Av, happens to have been yesterday. There was a famous a rabbi named Yochanan ben Zakkai. This is recorded in a part of the Babylonian Talmud. Famously goes to the newly installed Roman Emperor Vespasian and says, "Give me Yavna and its sages." And essentially, what he is saying, or the way that statement is interpreted in later Jewish tradition, is he's saying, I understand that the temple, what we call in Hebrew the Beit HaMikdash, which had been the center of Jewish worship, right? I mean, anyone who's spent much time reading the Hebrew Bible will understand this, reading the first 5 books of the Torah, that animal sacrifice and other forms of sacrifices was actually central to what Judaism was as a religion when the temple existed. So then the huge, massive kind of existential question is, what is Judaism without a temple where you can make animal sacrifices, right? This may seem very remote for us, but it was a massive, massive question at the time. And essentially, Yochanan ben Zakkai essentially imagines a radically different form of Judaism in which prayer and religious study replace the centralized temple and replace animal sacrifice. And this is what we now call Rabbinic Judaism. It is the Judaism that has existed ever since the temple has never been rebuilt. So Yavna, which is a town in the Galilee where Yochanan ben Zakkai and other kind of essentially Jews who survive what we call in Hebrew the Churban, the destruction of the temple, they recreate Jewish civilization without its epicenter. And they make this radical creative move to imagine something new. And the reason I wanted to use this word Yavna was I wanted to suggest that thinking about Jewish identity in the absence of a Jewish state was, but recognizing that this did not need to mean the end of Jewish identity, Jewish civilization, was what we needed to be willing to make a kind of similarly radical creative move today, given that I think the possibility of a Palestinian state alongside Israel has now been effectively foreclosed. And given that, for me at least, a Jewish state that holds millions of Palestinians without basic rights is not something that I, as a human being or as a Jew, can support.
That leads me to my next question. So we'll get into your essay a little bit, and then there's several questions already coming into the chat function as well. But you changed your position on the two-state solution. You had advocated for the two-state solution previously. Was there any event or something that led to your change? For example, another fellow who has spoken to our council a few years ago, Miko Peled, I'm sure you know him.
Yeah.
I mean, he's well received. He had a personal experience of actually going into the Palestinian territories that he talks about in his book, The Son of a General. Because for those of you who were not members yet at that time a few years ago, he is the son of General Matti Peled, who was an important figure who led the Jewish war of their Revolutionary War to create the Jewish state. And then again, he was influential in 1967 war as well. But he said, you know, he had never even met a Palestinian person until he came to the United States. And then he went back to Jerusalem and purposefully went to the other side, if you will. Have you had a personal experience like that, or is it merely a matter of coming to a better understanding?
No, I mean, I too have been very profoundly affected by personal experiences in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. Again, just for those of you who might not be as familiar, when inside Israel proper, in Israel within its original boundaries as created at the end of its War of Independence in 1949, Israel is about 80% Jewish and about 20% Palestinian. Sometimes those Palestinians are called Israeli Arabs in the American Jewish community, but they are the Palestinian citizens of Israel. When Israel in 1967 conquered the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem and some other territories, it essentially acquired this territory, which was exclusively, overwhelmingly Palestinian, and Israel never gave those people citizenship. Jewish settlers began to move into the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, though they're no longer in the Gaza Strip, but moved into the West Bank in larger and larger numbers, and they retained their Israeli citizenship. So they still have all the rights that come with being a citizen of Israel. But all of these Palestinians that Israel took control of in 1967 don't have citizenship. And so just to give you an understanding of what that means, it means that they are under the control of the Israeli state, and yet they can't be citizens of that state because of their religion, because they're Palestinians and not Jews. They can't vote for the government that controls their lives. They don't live under the same legal system. They don't have the same basic kind of due process that Israeli Jews have. And they don't have free movement. They often need kind of military permission to move from one part of the West Bank to another. So when you see that on the ground, what that looks like, an entire population of people, and this has been since 67, so more than 50 years, an entire population that's lived its entire life by and large without the basic rights that we take for granted. It is, it's monstrous to see it. It's lived in the lives of ordinary people, because again, when the state has no, it's not because Jews are bad people. I don't believe Jews are bad people. The point is that when a state is not accountable in any way to the people it controls, that state will act towards that population in very brutal ways. And it does. And so for me, it's been probably almost 20 years now since my first trip to the West Bank, and I've gone many times subsequently. And each time it's a very, very powerful experience. It was not that experience itself that led me to abandon the idea of two states. It certainly made me believe very strongly that Israel needed to end its undemocratic and unjust occupation of millions of Palestinians who were stateless non-citizens under Israeli control. But I did for many years believe that it might be possible to create a Palestinian state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem alongside Israel. But over the years, Israel has essentially subsidized more and more Jewish settlers to move into the West Bank. It's built a deeper, bigger and bigger infrastructure there. So for instance, Israel's newest medical school was built last year in the West Bank. 2 of Israel's Supreme Court justices are in the West Bank. There are many cemeteries in the West Bank. When you go there, you see that this does not look like a temporary project at all. Huge highways, huge industrial complexes. And I began to believe that people have been talking about the impending death of the two-state solution literally since the early 1980s. John Kerry said back, during the Obama administration that he thought two-state solution maybe only had a year or two left. And I came to the conclusion that it was now so implausible to create a Palestinian state alongside Israel, so difficult to unscramble that egg. And also, and we can talk about this more later, that the two-state solution, even if it were possible, would not address certain very fundamental issues that need to be addressed. It was those reasons that led me to begin thinking about alternatives. And so I started talking to a lot of people who work on different elements of this conflict, and also looking in more detail at other divided states and binational societies that have undergone massive political transitions, whether it was the former Yugoslavia or Northern Ireland or South Africa, and began to see my way towards an alternative. Again, not that it's unique to me. Many others, including particularly Palestinian intellectuals, have made some of these arguments, but this was the reason for the shift that ultimately led to this essay that we've been talking about.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Were you surprised at the reaction to your essay, especially among fellow Jewish Americans who essentially pegged you as anti-Semitic, or Alan Dershowitz, for example, who in his response threw the bomb, the final solution, that you are proposing a final solution. If a non-Jewish person had used that term, we would all be horrified, but Alan Dershowitz gets to put it right there in the title. Were you surprised by the reaction?
I was not surprised, in the sense that I know this conversation well, and I live in this community. You know, my family we go to an Orthodox synagogue. I lead services at that Orthodox synagogue. I mean, it hasn't been meeting recently on Shabbat, but you know, my children go to a Jewish day school. We live inside of the Jewish community, and not a left-leaning Jewish community, an observant and somewhat conservative Jewish community. So I'm very familiar with the way these conversations tend to play themselves out, and I've been at the center of such controversies before, so I have some experience with them. I think, frankly, the people who were most angry at me for abandoning the two-state solution were not people who themselves supported the two-state solution to begin with. They were people who were generally quite comfortable with Israel controlling millions of Palestinians who lack basic rights. They were, and I have kind of, there were others who did support, who were more sympathetic or had various different kinds of criticism, which is entirely fine. I don't expect everyone to disagree with me. I think for me, part of my challenge is to be a loving critic of my own community and convey both that criticism and that love at the same time, but also to remember that these debates, the jury will be out on these things for a long time. So I write an essay like this in the understanding that events in some ways will render their own verdicts, and that you can't judge the success of an essay or its significance at the moment, because I believe that, for better or for worse, events on the ground will force others sooner or later in the Jewish community to reckon with some of these realities.
Do you find that the debate about what to do about the Palestinians is more heated now under President Trump? And I'm trying to recall off the top of my head the fellow's name, the foreign minister of Israel, who made a misstep first, and he commented that Trump was the best president Israel ever had, and he backed up a step, and he said the best friend that Israel ever had was what he meant to say. Obviously, Trump is not the president of Israel, but is this political era better for Israel, or is it a detriment because it's allowing the politicians to seek their own personal political goals rather than the good of the state?
So there are, I think the Israeli government certainly thinks that Donald Trump has been a great president for Israel, and I think it's probably true that a majority of Israeli Jews believe that. Most American Jews American Jews will vote overwhelmingly for Joe Biden, in large measure because they're voting on domestic American issues. But I also think that there is a substantial chunk of American Jews, again, particularly younger and outside of the Orthodox community, who don't believe that Donald Trump's stance, which has essentially been to give the Israeli government whatever it wants, which is to say, to legitimize Israel's control over East Jerusalem without offering the Palestinians a capital in East Jerusalem, to legitimize Israel's control of the Golan Heights, and essentially to put forward a peace plan, I would say peace plan, with no Palestinian input, which gives Palestinians not an actual country, but really a kind of archipelago of disconnected towns and villages with Israel controlling all the territory in between. I think there are many American Jews who don't believe that's good for Israel, because ultimately they believe, as I do, that the fate of Israeli Jews and the fate of Palestinians are intertwined, that these are two peoples that live cheek by jowl together in one territory, and that allowing the Israeli government to more deeply entrench its brutal control over millions of Palestinians who lack basic rights is ultimately not only bad for Palestinians, but it's bad for Israeli Jews, because the violence of oppression is likely to rebound in violence towards Israeli Jews, and that you can't just segregate off a group of people living close by, ultimately, who are living under terrible conditions. Give you an example: the Gaza Strip, in which there are no Israelis living, but is really ultimately under Israel's control, because Israel controls access in and out with a kind of some help from Egypt. The Gaza Strip has now been declared by the United Nations uninhabitable for human beings because, for instance, there is barely any fresh water and not much electricity. And so the Gaza Strip is not far away, it's just down the beach from large Israeli cities like Ashdod and Ashkelon and ultimately Tel Aviv. And so, for instance, there is the threat of a cholera epidemic in Gaza could very easily spread into Israel. Israel has desalination plants on the southern coast that have now been shut down because raw sewage is being pumped into the Mediterranean from Gaza and then entering into those desalination plants. So I believe that the reason the Trump administration has been bad for Israel-Palestine, just as it's been bad for the United States, is that ultimately I believe that oppressive policies don't ultimately, in the long term, benefit Israeli Jews, because ultimately that, as Martin Luther King famously said, that we are all bound together in an inescapable garment of destiny, and that the denial of rights to one group ultimately, in some form or another, threatens everybody.
And I'm going to ask one more big question, or big answer question, maybe. And then go to the chat here. So again, one more reminder, if you've got a question, please type it in. I also read last fall in Foreign Affairs. And for those of you in the World Affairs Council, you already know that I really like that publication. But a fellow in there by the name of Yusuf Manayer wrote in the November-December issue last year that he is calling for one state, as you do, but a little more concretely in terms of creating a constitution for Israel. And that was actually an awakening for me. I did not realize Israel did not have a single constitution like the United States does. You were such strong allies and partners. I would have assumed that they had patterned their government after our own. And then of course I had to realize that they patterned their government after the British, who also don't have a single constitution. But Manayer calls for, and Manayer, for those of you who are wondering who I'm talking about, is the executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. And so an organization like that perhaps is a little less, is more easily dismissed by the Jewish community because, he's Palestinian. Whereas you're a member of their community, how dare you? But the points that he makes, he has several elements that he would include in a constitution that would recognize that the people have historical ties, both peoples have historical ties to the land. It would acknowledge the Jewish people's history of being persecuted, and that all citizens, regardless of religion, ethnicity, or national origin, have a right to safety and security. It would also recognize the wrongs done to Palestinian refugees and begin a process to repatriate and compensate them. It would offer citizenship to all peoples living in the land between the river and the sea, as it's called, and that all of those citizens would be equal before the law. And he would include a very high bar for amending this constitution, because one of the worries about granting Palestinians citizenship is that their numbers will overtake the Jewish people. Right now, they are roughly even. And that if all of the Palestinians who live in the occupied territories were given Israeli citizenship, the right to vote, that their numbers would overtake the Jewish population, and there would be this big birth season where everybody tries to have more children than the others, so that there's, or more move into the region so that their numbers stay at least even, or they get the numerical advantage. And so how do you feel about a concrete plan for a one-state solution along something along those lines? Or take the American Constitution or anybody else's?
Sure. So Yusuf is a friend of mine, and I actually cited his piece in mine. I think that in my piece, I didn't go into great detail in terms of what the constitutional or political system of this. I tried to sketch it out in kind of broader terms, but I'm sympathetic to everything that Yusuf lays out in that essay. Which is to say, I think that the core elements of one equal state. Another option would be a confederation, which we could talk about, which is essentially two states that pool their sovereignty, a little bit like happens in the European Union. But if we're talking about one state, I think what that one state needs to have is, first of all, very secure constitutional guarantees of basic rights, which Israel right now does not have, and which is part of what makes it possible for Israel to control so many people who don't have basic rights. So that would be one. And secondly, Israel, any political or constitutional system would need to take account of the fact that Israel-Palestine is a binational state, which is to say it includes two peoples, two nations. There is not an overarching Israeli-Palestinian national identity in the way that there is an American identity. And so what you need in a situation like that to create a political system that is political scientists sometimes call consociational. And what that means is, first of all, that you give a fair degree of autonomy to different groups based both geographically and demographically, which is to say, in Israel-Palestine, it's quite likely that most Jews would want to send their children to Hebrew language schools, and most Palestinians would want to send their children to Arabic language schools. There might be some who wanted to send their kids to schools that were a mix of both, but both communities would have a strong desire to have a communal and cultural autonomy when it had to do with things like language, religious practice, and other things. But secondly, what you would need to have is not just individual rights guaranteed, like by kind of a Bill of Rights that we have, but also a situation in which each of the two nations would have some veto power over things that they felt would be very harmful to them. So if you look at Belgium, for instance, which is a binational state, or Northern Ireland, which is not a state, but a territory that really has two nations, Protestants and Catholics, in it, you have a political system in which each community has the ability to be represented, so that you can't have a situation where the will of the majority can run roughshod over the perceived basic rights of one of the nations. So, for instance, in Northern Ireland, to give an example, there's always a prime minister and a deputy prime minister, and those kind of co-executives are always, one is always Protestant and one is always Catholic. And so that's an example of how you have a system in which both communities are always represented at the top of government.
Good. And in Lebanon, the current situation notwithstanding,
Right.
Lebanon has a similar distribution of power among its dominant groups that had worked until very recently. So at least it had worked for a few decades.
Yeah.
But the United States is another example. I mean, we're not a binational country, but we are multinational. We have people from all over the world and all religions. So clearly it can work. But do you think a constitution is the foundation on which it should be built? One of our questions asks, is there any motive for Israel to make any changes? Is it one of those things that need to be founded first?
So right now, most Israeli Jews are not interested in any significant change to the status quo, really. And you might say, why should they be? The status quo is working pretty well for them, which is to say, Israel, they enjoy basic rights. Israel controls millions of people who don't, but at relatively low cost. Israel is not being isolated internationally. There's no significant uprising going on. And generally what you find is that when populations that enjoy basic rights, that have basic privileges and rights and power, are very unlikely to give those up unless they are convinced that the status quo is not tenable anymore, that it's not possible anymore, right? It wasn't as if white Americans ended segregation because they just woke up one day and decided it was a bad idea, right? It was the civil rights movement that essentially forced the issue and started to change white American opinion, partly because of its moral vision, but partly also because white Americans began to realize that they just couldn't go on like this. The consequences was likely to be more and more destabilizing and chaotic and even violent if they continued to deny millions of African Americans the right to vote and the right to public accommodation. Similarly, in South Africa, or again in Northern Ireland, or in many other cases. So it's not surprising that most Israeli Jews are today content with the status quo, but that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that the status quo is morally acceptable, or even that it is sustainable in the long term. Because again, I think what we know is that sooner or later, people who lack basic rights will rise up, and they will force a challenge. They will make the lives of people who are denying them those basic rights difficult in one way or another. And so I think that the question that we need to ask ourselves is, how can we raise the costs for Israeli Jews of this brutal and undemocratic control of millions of Palestinians, but raise the costs in a way that is not violent, doesn't bring bloodshed, and raise the cost in a way that has a moral vision. So that, again, if you think about the legacy think about the civil rights movement, for instance, the way in which the civil rights movement was able to raise the costs of Jim Crow segregation to white Southerners, not by killing them, but through things like boycotts and strikes and mass movements that essentially showed them that African Americans would not accept the status quo, but offered them a vision of a society, what Martin Luther King called a beloved society, that would ultimately be more just and more equal and more harmonious, and ultimately better not only for African Americans, but for white Americans too. And of course, we're still engaged in that struggle in the United States today.
Yes, ongoing as we speak. One question that was sent to me. He says, I'm not sure you know about those intellectuals in the 1920s, like Judah Magnus, first president of Hebrew University, Martin Buber, et al., who recognized the problem of Palestinian population and supported a version of a one-state solution. It included a confederal structure like Switzerland or Belgium. In view of history of Arab-Israeli bloodshed, Holocaust, etc., do you believe that some version of that idea actually has any chance?
Yes, I do. In fact, and I mentioned some of those figures, Buber, Magnus, Henrietta Schultz, the American Jewish woman who founded Hadassah, Gershom Scholem, others, Albert Einstein for a while, Hannah Arendt, all of whom at various points were involved in this movement, which was called at one point Brit Shalom, a covenant of peace, basically of Jews, some of who defined themselves as Zionists, but who didn't necessarily believe that Zionism needed to mean a Jewish state that privileged Jews over Palestinians, believed in the existence of a Jewish society, what I call a Jewish home in the land in Israel-Palestine, but believed that a Jewish state that denied Palestinians' rights would ultimately lead to violence, as it did, and also would be a desecration of Jewish ideals as they saw them. And I think what's fascinating is that, many decades after people like Buber and Magnus and others imagined a binational state, we now see that many Palestinian intellectuals are actually proposing this idea. The Palestinian national movement for many decades was essentially essentially imagining one Palestine where Jews, they said, generally could live, as equals, but not as represented as a nation. And yet now what you see among many Palestinian intellectuals is actually something which I think is closer to what those Jewish intellectuals in the first half of the 20th century, again, they were a minority view in the Zionist movement, but still they were, I think, important intellectual voices. And I think it's interesting that now the strongest proponents of binationalism generally tend to come from Palestinian intellectual society.
There's a couple of questions that I'm going to combine. So if you have submitted them and don't like the way I combine them, send another one. But a couple of our participants, one argues, in the beginning you talked about the 1/3 live in the United States, 1/3 live in other places around the world, and the third live in Israel. But that third of the Jewish population living in Israel lives 24/7 with a loaded, cocked gun pointed at their heads. And therefore, do they have the right to see things differently than the 2/3 of the Jewish population who live elsewhere? Is there a weight to that Zionist fever? And then the other question is a little more related to the Holocaust. And I think, but tied into this perception of the Jewish people who live in Israel feeling a deeper pressure than perhaps the Jewish population elsewhere around the world. Jews are understandably incredulous at the promises by the Palestinians that peace would reign if they were granted citizenship. And another asks, do the Palestinians still argue for the elimination of the Jewish state?
So the answer to that last question is yes. The vast majority of Palestinians do not believe in the legitimacy of a Jewish state. That's true for the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem who are not citizens of that state. So who are controlled by that state but cannot become citizens because they're not Jews. But it's also true for the 20% of Israel's own citizens who are Palestinians, the quote unquote Arab Israelis. And again, I think it's, there's a line in Pirkei Avot, which is in the Mishnah, and the kind of the older inner core of the Talmud. It says, who is wise? The one who learns from all people. I think one of the things that's really important for us as Jews is to try to see reality through Palestinian eyes, which is to say, we may think, oh my goodness, how outrageous! They don't accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state. But how many American Jews would want to live in a self-declared Christian state? If the United States were to declare a Christian state, the Palestinians who live inside Israel want to be able to tell their children they can grow up to be prime minister of this country, and you can't do that if you're a Palestinian in a Jewish state. So I think now it's in both Israeli Jewish discourse and often in diaspora Jewish discourse, people often move very quickly from the idea that Palestinians don't accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state to the idea that Palestinians don't accept the legitimacy of Jews living in Israel-Palestine, or at least not living safely in Israel-Palestine. As I argue my piece, I think the memory of the Holocaust is a kind of a template, looms very, very large in Jewish conversations, which is to say the notion, even as you quoted Alan Dershowitz, right? My argument was an argument for one country in which everyone lives equally, right? He called that the final solution, which is essentially he equated it with genocide of Jews, right? And that's not that uncommon. Many Jews think in those terms. Again, I think partly because of the trauma of the Holocaust, and partly because of the way that trauma has been exploited by Jewish leaders in Israel and in the diaspora. But one of the things I try to argue in my piece, and I spend a fair amount of time doing this, is first of all, that if you look at the history of Palestinian behavior since the early 20th century, since the beginning of the Zionist movement, it is not the behavior of a group of people who have a Nazi-like kind of irrational, compulsive desire to kill Jews for the sake of Jews. Palestinians have acted very similarly to other movements of people who lack basic and individual rights. They have at times turned to violence, but let's remember, the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, killed almost 2,000 people in terrorist attacks between the late 1960s and the mid-1990s. The African National Congress advocated violence starting in the early 1960s. You know who the leader the critical leader who turned the African National Congress to support armed struggle after it had initially supported nonviolent struggle was Nelson Mandela, right? A man that most people now have a pretty high opinion of. What we see again and again in comparative context, and the political science research I think really bears this out, is that there is a relationship between oppression and violence, which is to say, as people gain more of a voice in their government, as they have more basic rights, violence goes down because people have the ability to express their grievances and gain remedies through a nonviolent process. And when you deny people that, it's in those circumstances that violence is most likely to flourish. One example I give of this actually is the situation of Palestinian citizens of Israel. As I said, 20% of Israel's citizens are Palestinian. They have much more access to Israeli Jews than do Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, whose movement is strictly controlled. So if they wanted to commit violence against Israeli Jews, they could do so much more easily. And yet, violence by Palestinian citizens of Israel against Israeli Jews. By the way, Palestinian citizens of Israel, for instance, compose a large percentage of Israel's doctors, right? They treat Israeli Jews in the most vulnerable circumstances. 50% of Israel's pharmacists are Palestinians, right? And yet violence is very, very low because, again, this basic norm, right, which is to say that if you give people basic rights, even though Palestinian citizens are discriminated against, the fact that they have citizenship and the right to vote is a big part of the reason that there's less violence. So my argument is fundamentally that if you look carefully at Palestinian behavior and you look at Palestinian writing on one state, and again, I would say to anyone listening on this call, and particularly Jews who might be engaged in this conversation, read what Palestinians write. Right? You quoted Yusuf Munayar. I have read an enormous amount of Palestinian writing on the question of what one state would look like. Almost to a person, it expresses a vision of equality in which Jews would have the right to live with the same basic rights, safety, dignity, equality as Palestinians. And yet we so often in the Jewish community have this vision that Palestinians essentially wake up in the morning simply wanting to kill Jews for no better reason than that's what their culture instructs them to do.
That's interesting. You had pointed out in your essay that Palestinians are held accountable for the Holocaust, yet they are not responsible for the Holocaust. And to imagine that all Palestinians are the Nazis when they are not is short-sighted. Is that a political function? Do you think that is a result of politics exasperating the situation that, if Jewish people in Israel don't defend themselves, are not prepared to defend themselves at the drop of a hat, we will be annihilated tomorrow?
I mean, that notion is certainly strong among Israeli Jews, and again, among many diaspora Jews too. But I think that, again, first of all, I think it's a fundamental misreading of Palestinian behavior. Not that Palestinian behavior has been perfect by any means. Palestinians have made significant mistakes and done things that I think are immoral. Again, just like other nationalist movements have done. But I also think that in putting Palestinians in this template of Nazis is deeply dehumanizing, right? Because what is the lesson? Essentially, if you're fighting Nazis, if you're in the equivalent of the Warsaw Ghetto, you have no moral obligations to those people. Your only obligation is to survive. You do whatever it takes to survive. And once you create that template, whether you have recognized it or not, you have essentially given yourself moral license to do anything. And that, I think, that frightens me a great deal because I think that throughout history and across the world, we see that it is dehumanization that then creates the context in which states can take acts of great violence towards vulnerable populations. And we have seen this template being used in Israel for acts of great and I think terrible violence on Palestinians who are, after all, a population that does not have a modern advanced army like Israel does not have missile defense systems like Israel has, that is deeply vulnerable, its civilian population, to the massive might of the Israeli army, an army that has essentially leveled the Gaza Strip 3 times over the last 15 years, for instance, in a way that has deeply again, imagine if you are a child who's grown up in Gaza and you have basically seen this fairly small territory of land basically bombed to rubble 3 times by the time you were 8 or 10 years old, right? There's a book by a Palestinian writer named Tariq Bakoni about Hamas, and I would recommend it. For instance, if you want to understand that movement. He talks about talking to a child, maybe a 3rd, 4th, 5th grader in Gaza, and the child is about to go back to school, and he says, "What are you looking forward to?" And the child says, "Well, I'm really frustrated because we're not going to have the soccer game. The soccer league is not going to be the way it was last year, and I don't think we're going to do as well this year." And so Tariq says, well, what happened? And he said, "Well, about half the kids on my team are dead." Again, this is, we have to try, and I think to fully internalize the humanity of Palestinians. And again, that's why reading Palestinian writing and engaging with Palestinians on a human level, I think, is so crucial for everyone, but particularly for Jews.
Anti-Semitism is real. I mean, there's no question about it. It occurs around the world. It occurs here in the United States. What do you think drives this ongoing anti-Semitism? I mean, can we still say it's because they murdered Christ? I mean, is that still the basic reason?
Anti-Semitism is a remarkable pathology in that it manages to take many different shapes, right? So Jews have been, people have blamed Jews for capitalism and Jews for communism, right? They've blamed Jews for being too tribal and also for being rootless cosmopolitans. Blame Jews for deicide, right? The killing of Christ, and also blame Jews for being secular atheists. I think that so it's hard to say what the essence of anti-Semitism is, but I think at its root, it has to do with the notion of Jews as an other, a kind of a group that will not assimilate, will not fully, that always wants to remain distinct from whatever group it's in, right? And always has that distinct identity that marks it apart from whatever the norms of the society. And I think that particularly in Christian Europe, but not only in Christian Europe, there has been a kind of a frustration which can ultimately lead to rage at the fact that Jews were not willing to essentially give up their distinctiveness, right? That distinctiveness which expresses itself in all kinds of different ways, right? There's a rabbi named Jonathan Sachs, who was the former chief rabbi of Britain, who's someone whose writing I like a lot, and he talks about the kind of the right to be different. And Jews, in some ways, have always, in a certain kind of way, been at the forefront of asserting that right to be different. I mean, if you look at Jewish law, right? Jewish law requires that Jews have a different set of dietary codes, right? That Jews mark their doors with a mezuzah, that Jews, in a whole series of ways, that Jews mark their difference. And I think that marking of difference, particularly in societies that have been under stress, that have looked for scapegoats, has been enraging for people. I think that Jews have done best when we have found allies who also wanted to be able to have the right to be different, and yet, or were seen as different, and yet wanted basic justice and equality. I mean, and I think and I think one of the lessons of modern history and even of recent American history is that our struggle for safety and equality is bound up with the struggle of other groups. So, for instance, if you look at the terrible shooting that took place in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and you look at what was motivating that man who killed those people on a Shabbat morning, what's striking is that the thing that initially was bugging him was not Jews. It was this perceived mass migration of these caravans from Central America. And he got inflamed by Donald Trump and other people's kind of nativist rhetoric about the idea that we were being invaded by Central American migrants. So then what led him to ultimately shoot up a synagogue? Well, he decided that he believed that these people in Central America were not really civilized enough, not organized enough to really invade America on their own. So he began to look for a kind of a hidden, sinister hand, like who was really behind this supposed invasion? And he decided that the Jews were behind it. George Soros was behind it, this group called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. This is also an interesting template, right? Because the stereotype historically of Jews has been different than the stereotype of, let's say, of Black people or Latino people. It's not of the historical stereotype is not necessarily of Jews as intellectually inferior, but Jews as a kind of sinister, evil genius, right? So this happened in the civil rights movement too. A lot of people thought, well, since African Americans are inferior, they surely could not be actually organizing the civil rights movement. It really must be the Jewish communists who are behind it. Something very similar played out in South Africa under apartheid as well, where people elevated the role of Joe Slovo, who was the leader of the South African Communist Party, who was born in Lithuania, Yiddish-speaking Jew who immigrated to South Africa because they were racist. They didn't believe South Africans could actually organize a movement. And so you see that because the way these different forms of bigotry intersect with one another, the bigotry of the belief that people of color are inferior, then combined with the notion that Jews are sinister geniuses who must be orchestrating things behind, and then you end up with dead people in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. And so to me, it seems to me the crucial lesson for us is that we must build alliances and be in solidarity with all groups of people whose rights are being threatened, so we can protect one another and not believe that somehow we can make a separate peace with white supremacists and that they will leave us alone and they will only focus on Black people or Latino people or Muslim people, that ultimately to recognize that ultimately our safety is intertwined.
Yeah, the humanization of all of us. So, and that takes us full circle back to your discussion of Palestine and Israel and what might be its future. One of the very first questions we got is the last question I'm going to ask you. Would you be willing to offer us a short list of good readings, people, books, people we could follow to find out more information about this issue?
Sure. So on the question of the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, from a Palestinian perspective, I would suggest Rashid Khalidi's book, The Iron Cage. Khalidi is a professor of Palestinian history at Columbia. If you wanted a kind of a very readable book that I would say offers a narrative which is more similar to the kind of Israeli Jewish mainstream view, I would suggest Ari Shavit's book, My Promised Land. Those tell some of the same historical events, but from two very, very different perspectives. In terms of the history of Zionism, I think there's a lot, but there's a famous book by Arthur Hertzberg called The Zionist Idea, which is is a good introductory essay, and then a lot of kind of historical documents from the Zionist experience. In terms of the question of kind of Jewish identity, I suppose I might suggest Jonathan Sachs's book, The Dignity of Difference.
Very good. Well, there are folks already indicating that they have enjoyed this very much. Thank you very much for your time. We have learned a great deal. Unless anybody has anything else, I would like to wrap it up and say this has been presented by the Peoria Area World Affairs Council. If you haven't joined us yet, please do so. You are welcome to see what's coming up on pawac.org. It's a little bit behind on updating, but it'll be updated this weekend. And we have all of the videos from this past summer of staying at home. We have a YouTube channel, so find the Peoria Area World Affairs Council on YouTube if you want to see any of our past events. And follow us on Facebook. And I think that'll do us for today. Thank you, Peter. It has been really informative and very lively.
Thanks a lot, very much.
All right. Everyone have a great weekend. Bye.
Thanks. Bye. Thanks. Thank you.